Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola, joined by Rania Khalek. Hey Rania.
Hey Kevin.
And we're joined by Ben Norton, who's a good friend of the show. He's an assistant editor for the Grayzone, also hosts, we haven't talked to you since you launched the show on Rockfin Propaganda Today. So welcome, Ben.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's one of my favorite shows. I've been a patron for a long time, so I'm always glad to be back.
Yeah, it's really good to see you. And I think there's a lot of topics that we'll maybe touch on throughout the show, but we wanted to have you to discuss Nicaragua because it is where you're based, right?
Yeah.
How is it there, Ben? It must be really hard. Like, you live in a dictatorship. There's this guy, Daniel Ortega. I hear he's just like arresting people for his fake elections.
Yeah, and I hear there's like
you can't see, but Ortega, his goons, they have a gun to my head off the screen, just off. You can't see it. I can't move the camera, otherwise they'd shoot me. But
no, after like constant Russian hypersonic weapons being shot at your forehead on a daily basis, without the Nicaragua government doing anything to help you.
Well, I lick the boots of the dictator, which is why they don't shoot me with the Russian ray gun. But you know, if you're a good, loyal, patriotic American, then you're doomed. Don't come to Nicaragua. Okay. No, I mean, although Nicaragua just received millions of Cuban vaccines and Russian vaccines, so I might turn into like a Russian-speaking Kremlin bot for real this time if I get that Sputnik vax pretty soon.
Oh God! Okay, listen. If you blink twice, if you want us to call Kenneth Roth, just blink twice if you need help.
Save me, Ken.
No, so that's all, of course, in jest.
Listen, if you're ready to defect, I know that there are some Silicon Valley billionaires that will bankroll a public relations campaign, and you can come forward before Congress and say you're a whistleblower from Nicaragua. Just, Anyway,
in the 1850s, there was a white American mercenary who had nothing to do with Latin America, didn't speak 5 words of Spanish, named William Walker. And he invaded Nicaragua and declared himself president. He was also a Christian fundamentalist. He declared himself president and said he was on a mission from God, like a bad version of the Blues Brothers. And he reinstated slavery. So if I declared myself the new William Walker, I guarantee you the U.S. government would recognize me.
Oh my God, you would get like so much seed funding for your venture. But of course, and actually I heard you, that was a pretty wild story that you just told. I actually heard you tell it on a clip of your show that you posted to YouTube, which are clips that you post quite frequently to, I think, both the Grayzone channel and Moderate Rebels channel. So you always have these wild stories that I've never heard of just like that. So I recommend people check out those clips of your show. But of course, all this is in jest for anybody who thinks we're being serious. Sorry, Ken. But all that's to say is, you are in Nicaragua, and we want to talk to you about some other stuff too. But of course, we want to really focus on Nicaragua first because there's these upcoming elections that are about to take place. There seems to be already an attempt to lay the groundwork by the US and the OAS to declare the elections fraudulent even before they happen, which is pretty much what they do to any leftist government across the region. But also there's this sanctions package that the U.S. Congress, I'm not sure if they already passed it or they're preparing to pass it, the Renacer Act, which could be devastating for Nicaragua's economy. So I guess, can you just kind of give us a brief overview? We hear a lot about Venezuela, and we kind of know what's going on in Venezuela. We hear a lot about Cuba and what the U.S. is doing in Cuba, but Nicaragua doesn't get talked about so much. So what's going on in Nicaragua right now in terms of the sort of U.S. propaganda machine going into full gear against Nicaragua, claiming that Daniel Ortega is rounding people up so that he can, win these fraudulent elections? And what is going to happen in Nicaragua if this sanctions package goes through?
Great question. And there's a few things in there that I want to unpack. I'll begin broadly for people who don't know anything about Nicaragua. Just in a brief nutshell, I've done other videos talking about the history of Nicaragua. And the U.S. meddling in Nicaragua goes back 200 years. The U.S. has invaded Nicaragua multiple times. The U.S. had 3 different military occupations of Nicaragua. The U.S. installed a puppet dictatorship of the right-wing dynasty, the Somoza family, and they had 3 different members of the Somoza family who governed the country with an iron fist, like a kind of monarchy. And then in 1979, after nearly 20 years of struggle, the socialist Sandinista front, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, the FSLN, they succeeded after years of armed struggle in overthrowing the U.S. puppet dictatorship in July 1979, and they launched the Sandinista Revolution. The Sandinista Front has always been an interesting hybrid politically. It is socialist, openly socialist, and very left-wing economically. It's geared around supporting poor people and the working class and labor unions and peasants. It's also very strongly Christian in orientation. It's actually the only real example of a liberation theology movement, as it's called, taking state power in Latin America. And it also very much is based in the peasantry, and in the countryside, which is something unique about Nicaragua compared to, say, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela or other revolutionary processes in Latin America. And the Sandinistas took power in a revolution in 1979, and they governed in the 1980s. And then, of course, people, if you know about Nicaragua, you probably know that in the 1980s, the U.S. government waged a terrorist war. The CIA trained the so-called Contras, which, for people who don't know, Contra in Spanish is contrarrevolucionario, which means counter-revolutionary. That was the literal name, counter-revolutionary. And the CIA trained these death squads who terrorized people, massacred civilians, burnt down schools and hospitals to try to wage a terror war to destabilize the country. The U.S. imposed a blockade, which caused major economic problems, inflation, a shortage of goods. And then there was an election in 1985, and President Ortega won the election, and the Sandinista Front was in power. And then in 1990, with all of the violence after nearly a decade of war and the blockade and economic difficulties, the population was really tired. And in 1990, the U.S. government helped create a candidate. They trained her. They funded her campaign. Her name is Violeta Chamorro. She's from the richest oligarch family in the country. The Chamorro clan has had 7 presidents in the history of Nicaragua since the country was formed in the early 1800s. And the U.S., through the National Endowment for Democracy and one of the first operations from the newly created NED in the 1980s, they helped create her campaign. They funded everything, and she won the election in essentially what was stolen, an election stolen from the U.S., and that brought in the neoliberal era. It was the first time in modern history that a revolutionary government, a government that came in through a revolution, willingly ceded power, gave up power through a democratic election. In 1990, the Sandinistas went into the opposition, and they began organizing again. And the Sandinistas had the power to wage a new armed struggle, but they decided to reform, to regroup, to organize among working class barrios in Nicaragua, and to go through the democratic electoral process. And by 2007, from 1990 until 2007, for 17 years, there was the neoliberal era. Poverty skyrocketed, unemployment skyrocketed, prostitution was a huge problem, drug dealing was a huge problem with narcos, drug cartels and all of that, violence, and the country was a mess. And in 2007, which is, in the middle of this, this movement of leftist governments across Latin America, the so-called pink tide, the Sandinistas, they came back to power through democratic elections in 2007, and they have since stayed in power, winning elections consistently. And polls show that they consistently have support of around 60 to 64% of the population. So roughly 2/3, and 3/5 to 2/3 of the population. And the neoliberal opposition forces are entirely bankrolled by the U.S. And the thing is, the reason that Nicaragua isn't that well known about, including by people on the left, is that when the Sandinistas came back in 2007, they kind of rebranded a little bit. Ironically, they kind of rebranded as Democratic Socialist, which you would think that like the the wave of so-called Democratic Socialists in the U.S. would be excited about that there's an actually existing Democratic Socialist government. Another reason that they didn't get a lot of attention is because they intentionally kind of laid low. The strategy was that we don't want to encourage more problems with U.S. imperialism, so we're not going to stick our head out too high. We are going to renationalize the power grid and the water system and all these the commanding heights of the economy that were privatized by the neoliberals, and they did that. And they also engaged in massive land reform, which is extremely important in a country like Nicaragua, where over half of the population still lives in the countryside. So they helped redistribute land to poor farmers and peasants and humble people, and have given tens of thousands of land, actually I think hundreds of thousands of land deeds to people to make sure that companies or big landlords can't kick them off their land. So they have engaged in these important processes. As soon as Ortega came back in 2007, one of his first promises, which he immediately fulfilled, was that he was going to create free universal healthcare and free universal education, which he almost immediately did a few months after coming back into power. And still today, Nicaragua, although it's the second poorest country in terms of GDP in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, it has one of the best healthcare systems in Latin America. And the education system is totally free, including higher education. So the Sandinistas have made a lot of strides, but it's true that they held their heads kind of low and were trying not to bring more attention to themselves, trying not to stir trouble. And that was until 2018. In 2018, the elite business interests led by the Chamber of Commerce, the COSEP in Nicaragua, they were tired of Ortega, who was in his third term, and he had been winning the elections, and he was very popular, and they couldn't defeat him at the ballot box, so they attempted a coup, a very violent coup attempt, of course, with the backing of the U.S. And we can talk about some of the people behind the coup, but most of the leaders of the coup in their NGOs and their organizations are funded by the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy, through the U.S. Agency for International Development. These are CIA cutouts that in the 1980s were used to fund and send weapons to the Contras and the opposition then in the 1980s. So there was a very violent coup attempt in 2018. And that was the moment when Nicaragua once again entered the limelight. It was in the corporate media constantly. There was all this propaganda saying that the government is supposedly a dictatorship. And the coup failed. We can talk more about the coup. It was very violent. Sandinistas were literally hunted down. I know friends whose family members and loved ones were killed or tortured or wounded in a very violent coup attempt. And it was very similar to the coup attempts we've seen, especially the coup attempts in Venezuela in 2014 and 2017 with these blockades that they constructed. So there's these tactics we've seen. We saw similar tactics in Hong Kong, these very violent tactics of insurgency to try to basically cause a low-intensity civil war, to create a civil war, to invite international intervention, to overthrow the government. That was what they tried to do, and it failed. And of course, because it failed, Nicaragua was punished. And in late 2018, the U.S. Congress passed the NICA Act, which is a hilarious, I always point this out. It's so funny. It shows how dumb U.S. Congress people are, because I forget what the exact acronym is, but it's NICA Act, NICA Act. But the A in the NICA Act stands for act. So it actually is NIC Act. There's act in the name twice. But it shows how smart the Cuban lobby is in Miami, which is what drafted the legislation. And it was Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who has now been replaced by this even more right-wing fanatic. And also, it was co-drafted by Albiocires, the Democrat in New Jersey. So this is bipartisan legislation, totally bipartisan. And it was passed in Congress in late 2018 with zero opposition. Now, to be fair, it was passed on a voice vote. You know how they sneakily push those through, but there was zero opposition to the legislation, including from the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And then that basically created a financial blockade. It's not a full-on economic embargo like we see on Cuba and Venezuela. So Nicaragua still has been able to do trade, but there's a financial blockade. The Nicaraguan government and state institutions have been blocked from accessing loans and the international financial system. Although, to be fair, there was an exception made for COVID, but that was a very exceptional case. But there still is a kind of financial blockade on Nicaragua. And you mentioned that now it's very likely that this November 7th, when there's another election, all the polls show the Sandinista front is going to win around 2/3 of the vote. And the opposition is going to be crushed because they're very unpopular and very corrupt. And in response to that, it's very likely that the U.S. Congress is going to push through this legislation called the Renacer Act. Renacer in Spanish means rebirth. And the Renacer Act, it doesn't have the name act in it. It doesn't have the word act in the name twice. And it's going to result in even more sanctions. And basically, it's probably going to create a kind of de facto blockade, like the blockade of Cuba and Venezuela. So what it's going to result in is essentially the Trump administration and National Security Advisor John Bolton had declared a so-called troika of tyranny in Latin America. They singled out Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the three countries with self-identified socialist governments that had revolutionary processes. And by the end of this year, it's very likely that all three of those countries are going to be under U.S. blockades.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're enjoying this week's episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Here is a reminder to support our show and help us keep going. You can go to Patreon or Rockfin or Spotify to support our show. So here's the links. If you want to support us on Patreon, go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. If you want to support us on Rockfin and become a subscriber of our channel, go to rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. If you'd like to support us on Spotify, pull up our show, the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and subscribe to our paid content. On all three spaces, you get access to full episodes and any other additional exclusive content we post every month. So thank you, and back to the show.
So, what's interesting is I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. Everyone who listens to this show knows that I'm a huge pessimist, but I live in the Middle East. You live in Latin America, and I'm just curious if you can relate to this, if there's something similar happening in the region that you're in. I'm in Lebanon, and there's interesting stuff happening in this region in the sense of it feels like or seems like the rise of China, this kind of like coming rise of China, is creating some space, not a lot of space, but has created some space for movements, anti-imperialist fighting forces in this region to be able to push back against U.S. dictates a little bit. Like, for example, Hezbollah recently was able to transport sanctioned Iranian oil through sanctioned Syria into Lebanon through a sanctioned movement. And the U.S. didn't do anything about it. The U.S. was just like kind of shrugged its shoulders about it. And it seems like
they forced Jordan to normalize with Syria and claim that they were going to send their own, but
they did do that. But even if that deal goes through, by the way, like the deal and what you're talking about is like the day that Nasrallah announced that he was going to import Iranian oil because of Lebanon's electricity crisis. The day that he announced that, later that afternoon, Dorothy Shea, the U.S. ambassador, announced that the U.S. was going to help Lebanon import gas through Jordan and Syria, and that they would waive the Caesar sanctions so that Lebanon wouldn't be subject to Caesar sanctions. Whether this actually happens we'll see, because it actually needs a lot of work. All these rebel groups the U.S. funded in Syria actually destroyed the pipeline that goes through Syria. So if they're serious about it, it's going to take like months and months, at least 6 months, to even repair the damage to that pipeline. And that's even if this goes through. And if it does go through, it'll give the country about 4 hours of electricity a day. So it doesn't really solve the crisis. But anyways, my point is to say,
thank it was you, really Dorothy Shea. Thank you, U.S. Embassy. 4 hours of electricity. Yes.
Woo! But, I mean, it was well played by Nasrallah, but it just seems, I guess, to bring it back to the kind of like where I'm going with this is I feel like today, at least in our lifetimes, it feels like this is the first time I can remember when there actually are like movements that are sort of connected internationally in some way or allied to each other in some way that are able to push back against these crazy unilateral American policies in a way that they weren't able to before. And I was going to bring Latin America into this because also like Venezuela's under siege, Iran's under siege. They're literally trading oil with each other and the US doesn't always stop it because it's not able to. And so I'm curious if the rise, the sort of like new multipolar world that we're beginning to enter, the rise of China and other powers are creating more space in Latin America for countries with leftist movements to remain sovereign and able to like exist despite the ongoing hybrid wars from the US.
Great question. I would say, first of all, that I actually wrote an article for Al Mayadeen, which they have a new English language section. It's, for people who don't know, it's one of the best Lebanese websites, pan-Arab website and media outlet. And they have an English section and an Arabic and also a Spanish section, which is popular in Latin America. And I write some articles in English and Spanish for them. And I wrote one recently about the growing connections between the resistance movements in Latin America and the al-Muqawama, the resistance axis in West Asia, right? So Iran, especially now under Raisi, who's taking a very independent foreign policy and working a lot with China and Russia and Latin America, we've seen major growing ties, not only between Iran and Venezuela, which has gotten attention, but Iran and Nicaragua, and Iran and Cuba, and Iran and Bolivia. So it's not a coincidence that that representatives from Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia all attended the inauguration of Raisi and met with Raisi in his first week of power in Iran. And of course, we've seen that with Syria, that Venezuela in particular played a very important role in supporting Syria. And actually, Hugo Chavez gave a speech. I was doing research for this article that I wrote for Al Mayadeen, and Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan president, I think this was in 2011 before he died in 2013. So at the beginning of the war in Syria, he gave a speech in response to, in a quip, against the U.S. declaration of the axis of evil. Hugo Chavez said that they were creating an axis of the brave. He said Venezuela was launching an axis of the brave with Syria and with other countries. So there was a lot of solidarity there, and we've seen economic ties growing. You mentioned the very important trade of oil, but not just oil, other goods between Venezuela and Iran. In Venezuela, Iran opened up a supermarket chain, and my colleague Anya Parampol visited the supermarket in Caracas, and we published a video at the Grayzone showing this Iranian supermarket chain, and all of the goods there are made in Iran, which is incredible. So instead of Venezuela, which is unfortunately very dependent on food imports, there's a long story, but the short of it is that when oil was discovered 100 years ago in Venezuela, ever since then, Venezuela has been very heavily dependent on imports because it's an oil petrostate. It exports oil and uses the oil money to buy imports, similar to Lebanon, except without oil. Lebanon is very heavily dependent on imports. And that's been a policy that has been going on for 100 years in Venezuela. The difference is that when Hugo Chavez came in, he began using that oil revenue to help poor people, to fund social programs, whereas before, all that oil revenue had gone to elite rich people. But the point is that Venezuela is very heavily dependent on food imports, and until recently, Venezuela was still importing food from the United States. And now with the blockade of the US and the sanctions, Venezuela has been looking to import food from other countries, including Iran, Russia, China. Interestingly, Turkey has become a source of goods for Venezuela, and also Mexico. So anyway, the point is that what's interesting is, as much as the US pressures these countries, it does do damage, but it also encourages these countries to find new ways around the sanctions. So it's a sign, as economist Michael Hudson has been saying in the interviews that Max and I have been doing, Max Blumenthal and I have been doing with Michael Hudson. He talks about this process of economic decoupling. That is, the Russian and the Chinese and the U.S. economies, especially the Chinese and the U.S. economies, and the European economies are all very much linked together with their trade and their production patterns. And now we see the problems with, like the supply chains, that there's a process of decoupling, of delinking those economies from each other, right? And Michael Hudson, the economist, often points out that as much as the sanctions hurt in the short term, some of these countries economically in the long term are actually kind of grateful, especially China and Russia, because it has encouraged them to drop the dollar. China's been selling off its US debt very rapidly. Russia has been dropping its trade, and now Russia, over half of the trade it does is in non-dollar denominated trade. And this is true for Iran as well. Iran is slowly finding new ways around the sanctions, and Venezuela as well is finding new ways around the sanctions. So it is very difficult, but I think what you're pointing out is that the rise of China, actually, it very much has open space, not just politically and diplomatically, but even more so economically. Because still politically, China, until really the past year or two, politically and diplomatically, China was very cautious. It didn't really challenge, and diplomatically, it didn't really challenge the U.S. openly in a lot of ways. But economically, China being the second largest economic power in the world, and very soon to overpass the U.S., the fact that it's this massive economic bloc, and especially if it further integrates its economy with Russia, which looks very likely, then that opens up a lot of possibilities for these countries that are under sanctions. And Venezuela and Iran and now Lebanon, I think, are the beginning of this trend, which is why the U.S. is so desperate to try to counter it. And we see these ridiculous, just incompetent attempts to try to challenge China by doing like something that is like the poor man's version. No offense to poor people, we shouldn't use that term, but like a horrible cheap knockoff. Like, they sell those like Gucci knockoff bags. Well, that's what like the U.S. geopolitical equivalent. And we see now, a few days ago, Antony Blinken was in Ecuador, and he announced that the U.S. is like giving all of these trade deals, and the U.S. is going to invest in infrastructure to try to challenge the Belt and Road Initiative, because under the socialist president Rafael Correa, Ecuador became part of the Belt and Road, and China began building infrastructure. So the U.S., they said they were going to help Ecuador, in scare quotes, by buying Chinese debt. But what they actually did is they trapped Ecuador in more debt than it had before. But instead of Chinese debt, it's now IMF debt. And now the U.S. government says that they're going to challenge the Belt and Road by helping Ecuador build infrastructure, which is hilarious because the U.S. can't even build infrastructure in its own country. How do we expect it to build infrastructure abroad? So we see that the rise of China and these policies, like you mentioned, of sending oil from Iran to Lebanon, it's encouraging the U.S. try to do similar policies, but they're just not thought out well. They're incompetent, and they're cheap knockoffs, and they're not going to work.
And so along the lines of what we've been talking about here, I think there's a really important political case to raise, just because in the last week, since Rania and I were able to do a show, the U.S. was successful in extraditing Alex Saab to the United States. And I'd like to get your comment on the fact that he's now going to be put on trial. And you can give a full introduction of who Alex Saab is. We did a bit of we did cover this. We had an interview with Sarah Flounders, who's involved with the Free Alex Saab campaign, as one of the representatives who has done some really good solidarity activism work around his case. But of course, he was trying to open up a trade relationship with Iran, if I have it correctly, and because Venezuela needs food, and as a result of the crippling sanctions from the United States. And now I see that this is something that your colleague Anya flagged. I see that days after the extradition, the Justice Department has now charged 5 more people allegedly involved with Venezuela's assistance program, which delivers food and goods to 6 million homes each month. And so they've been charged with money laundering. They keep going after these people with these kinds of crimes, as if they're like people at Deutsche Bank or people at HSBC or something like that who are involved in the kind of thing that maybe has been documented in these Pandora Papers or the Panama Papers or whatever.
Yeah, or the banks that have consistently laundered money on behalf of Colombian and Mexican drug cartels, which, by the way, that was one of the main reasons that the banking sector was able to come back to life after the 2008 crash. It was because they got all this liquidity from Mexican and Colombian drug cartels. The Guardian actually surprisingly did an article on that, admitting it. So they don't care about money laundering. The reality is that the U.S. government claims that anyone who is trying to get around its illegal unilateral sanctions is money laundering. This is part of this new strategy of lawfare, of judicial warfare, right? We saw it used against the Workers' Party in Brazil, against Lula da Silva to imprison him, to impeach and launch a soft coup against President Dilma Rousseff. And now we see it again used against Huawei. We saw with Meng Wanzhou, who was the CFO, the chief financial officer of Huawei, who was imprisoned and then held in house arrest in Canada for 3 years because the U.S. wanted to extradite her. And what was her supposed crime? Money laundering. Now, how did she supposedly money launder, in scare quotes? Because Huawei did business with Iran. And the U.S. says, well, Iran is under sanctions. There are illegal unilateral sanctions, but you went around our financial system and you supposedly did money laundering to do business with Iran, so you're guilty of money laundering. And we see the same exact thing used against Alex Saab right now, and now against the 5 people accused of supposedly money laundering as part of the CLAP, that is the CLAP food program. What is CLAP? CLAP stands for Local Committees for Production and Food. And what it is a program that after the U.S. blockade and sanctions were imposed, the country, I mean, it has food, but food is increasingly unaffordable because of inflation, because of the U.S. economic war. So in order to provide food to people to make sure that they're not going hungry, the government created these food boxes, the food committees called CLAP, and each community, we've done some reporting on this at the Grayzone. I've been to Venezuela numerous times, and I've visited some of these food sites where if you're in a local barrio, your local neighborhood, every neighborhood has their committee of the CLAP. And every 2 weeks, they get together and volunteers distribute these food bags or boxes to each family, to each household in the community. And the food comes from the government, and it's basically free. It costs a few pennies. It's mostly just a symbolic payment. And over 80%, the number has increased, but now over 80% of the population receives this food. And it includes rice and wheat and cornmeal and beans and powdered milk and oil, like all of the staples that you need. And sometimes it includes like a chicken and, like pork. And so this program is extremely important for keeping Venezuelans healthy and not hungry. And the U.S. government has repeatedly targeted the CLAP program to the U.S. wants Venezuelans to go hungry. It wants to destroy the food program. And this is the explicit goal revealed by the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran. My colleague Max Blumenthal wrote an article, his name is Dick Nephew, and he wrote this book. This Dick wrote this book called The Art of Sanctions. And in this book, he talks openly about how the goal of the sanctions that he designed in the Obama administration against Iran were meant to increase hunger, to increase instability, to increase unemployment, to make people suffer, to destabilize the government. That is the explicitly stated policy, and that is exactly what the U.S. government is doing in Venezuela. Now, where does Alex Saab fit into this? Alex Saab, he's a businessman, and you constantly see in corporate media reports, they refer to him as a Colombian businessman, which is not wrong. He is a businessman, and he was born in Colombia, but he is a naturalized Venezuelan citizen, and he is a diplomat. He has a Venezuelan diplomatic passport. He is a special diplomatic envoy for Venezuela. And Why is that? Because what happened is that during the Bolivarian Revolution, when Hugo Chavez came in, going back several years, going back a decade, Alex Saab, was doing business deals with the Venezuelan government. That is not illegal. It is not illegal for a Colombian businessman to do deals with the Venezuelan government. But according to the U.S., anyone who does business with countries it targets with sanctions is supposedly engaged in money laundering, because the U.S. thinks it's the emperor of planet Earth. So Alex Saab was, for going back a decade, was helping to negotiate deals with the Venezuelan government. He developed a lot of contacts in Iran, in Turkey, in other parts of West Asia. And what happened is that when the U.S. imposed the more and more sanctions, starting with Obama, by the way, in 2015, when Obama declared Venezuela through an executive order a, quote, extraordinary and unusual threat to the national security of the United States. And the sanctions increased, and then the U.S. blockade was imposed by Trump. So in response to that, Alex Saab was turned into a diplomatic envoy by the Venezuelan government to go to countries like Iran and Turkey to find ways to buy food, to go around the U.S. financial system and around the U.S. sanctions, and to send that food to Venezuela so the government could distribute that food through the CLAP food program to poor and working class people and over 80% of the population. So because he was doing that, and particularly in Iran, the U.S. government said that he was, quote, money laundering. And now on the way, actually, he was going to Iran to negotiate food deals and other goods with Iran. And his plane stopped in Cape Verde in Africa. And they stopped in Cape Verde to refuel. And he was arrested. And in fact, he was arrested before there was an Interpol warrant out for his arrest, which is an incredible sign. It was a kidnapping. There was nothing legal about this in any single way. Now, Interpol has always been, look up the history of Nazis and Interpol. Interpol has always been a tool of Western imperialist countries. Many of the original leaders of Interpol were former Nazis, because 2/3 of the West German Justice Ministry after World War II were former Nazis, including top-level Nazi officials. Capitalist West Germany never denazified like socialist East Germany did. And anyway, the point is that the original leaders of Interpol were former Nazis. So it has a long history of being a tool of Western imperialism. But Interpol, at the U.S. request, released an arrest warrant for Alex Saab, which you might see the sophisticated propaganda will say that. But that was after he was kidnapped in Cape Verde at U.S. orders. And he was held in solitary confinement 23 hours per day. His lawyers say he was tortured. He was denied medical attention for over a year. This was in 2020, mid-2020, when he was kidnapped. And then finally, last week, this October, he was extradited to the U.S., and he was extradited right before a left-wing party was going to take power in Cape Verde, and the left-wing party had said that they were not going to extradite him. So this was like an emergency extradition by these corrupt right-wingers who were bribed by the U.S. government. The U.S. embassy announced that it was going to invest like $100 million in Cape Verde, which who knows if that money will ever come, of course. But the U.S. basically bribed Cape Verde. The corrupt right-wing government agreed to extradite, that is, kidnap Alex Saab, who is a diplomat, who has diplomatic immunity, and who is now going to be sent to the U.S. for a kangaroo court and a show trial, just like Julian Assange. I mean, Julian Assange, his case is very similar to Alex Saab's. However, Julian Assange's case is in some ways even more terrifying. Well, they're both terrifying in different ways. Alex Saab is not a U.S. national. He is a naturalized Venezuelan citizen with a Venezuelan diplomatic passport. And Julian Assange, similarly, is an Australian national. And they're both, the U.S. wants to extradite both of them to try them and imprison them using domestic U.S. law. But what's even more terrifying about Alex Saab's case is that he is a diplomat and he is supposed to have diplomatic immunity. And then, of course, what's terrifying about Julian Assange's case is that he's a journalist. So there's a lot of parallels between those cases and with Meng Wanzhou, the Chinese Huawei executive, and there's a North Korean business executive who the U.S. is trying to imprison, trying to extradite from Malaysia. He was detained in Malaysia at U.S. orders, and the U.S. is trying to extradite this North Korean businessman for, again, supposedly money laundering, i.e., going around U.S. sanctions on North Korea.
It's so terrifying. I mean, that's the behavior of a dictator. Like the US. And then what's crazy is that in all of these cases, the media is unquestioningly justifying it. Every write-up I saw on Alex Saab in the mainstream press was that, first of all, they stripped him of his diplomatic, of like the fact that he's a diplomat. They stripped him of that label. And they all just call him Colombian businessman, corrupt Colombian businessman. And I love that they emphasize Colombian because Colombia is a corrupt country. And so in a lot of people's minds, that kind of works. But it's completely insane. Like our media just unquestioningly justifies the actual kidnapping of people. And then I saw it was so concerning that he wrote this letter that his wife read at a rally in Caracas, Alex Saab's wife, where he actually stated, I'm like totally mentally sound. I have no intention to hurt myself or kill myself. So like if for some reason I end up dead and they say I committed suicide, it's not true. Which just speaks to the level of fear of being held by the Americans, because they will torture you and possibly suicide you.
Well, I know we need to start wrapping, but we laid down to rest our beloved war criminal Colin Powell this last week, and there's plenty of coverage out there and discussion about his role in being the pitch man for the Iraq War, and we all saw the iconic photo shared once more of him holding up that vial that's just a prop for this war based on lies. But there's a lot to say about his role in Latin America and in your region where you're based in Nicaragua, because he was there in government. He was part of the Reagan administration. He was someone who was in favor of these dirty wars in Latin America. So I just think before we conclude, it would be good to give you an opportunity to share any tidbits or whatever you'd like to say on Colin Powell's role in Latin America.
He was such a noble, brave man. No, I mean the people spilling crocodile tears over him, it's just so cynical. This guy, not only the second Iraq war, he has so many crimes to his record. And do people not even know what the Powell Doctrine is? Like, has that just been flushed down the memory hole? I remember when the Powell Doctrine, I'm not that old, but like I remember when I was younger, constantly hearing the Powell Doctrine, like he was praised for having this military doctrine. What is the Powell Doctrine? Really, at the end of the day, bomb the hell out of the country, bomb it into submission, destroy everything, and use, as he'd like to use, quote, overwhelming force. That's the term he constantly used. Overwhelming force. That's the Powell Doctrine. And it wasn't just the shock and awe in the second Iraq war. Let's not forget the first Iraq war, when he was the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, rather. He was the head of the U.S. military, and he oversaw the use of the Powell Doctrine that devastated Iraqi civilian infrastructure. This was back, not in 2003, in 1991, well before the Bush Jr. administration. In the Bush Sr. administration of CIA agent turned CIA director turned president, George H.W. Bush, Powell oversaw horrible, blood-curdling war crimes in the Gulf War. I actually did a video about this back when I was at the Real News. I did a 10-minute documentary about the crimes when George H.W. Bush died, of the war crimes of George H.W. Bush, focusing on the Gulf War and the war in Panama, both of which were overseen by Powell, who was the top U.S. military figure at the time. In the case of Panama, I would recommend the famous documentary, The Panama Deception, showing how the U.S. killed likely tens of thousands of civilians in Panama, just bombing working class barrios, just like devastating large parts of Panama, and which was ironic because Noriega had been a CIA asset for many years and had been actually involved in using drug money to help fund the CIA's death squads in Central America, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. But he outlived his usefulness. And then the U.S. collectively punished Panamanian civilians and just bombed the hell out of them. And then in the Gulf War, which was even worse, the U.S. bombed the hell out of Iraq, destroyed hospitals, almost all of the bridges in the country, destroyed most of the roads intentionally. This is all intentional. The U.S. bombed the Al Amaria shelter, which was a shelter full of Iraqi civilians, and hundreds of civilians were massacred. And the U.S. later admitted that that was an intentional strike on the Al Amaria shelter. So we're talking about blood-curdling war crimes. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the worst of all, the Highway of Death. That's what it's called. Look it up. The Highway of Death, in which the U.S. military massacred thousands of Iraqi troops and also Palestinians who were expelled by the Kuwaiti monarchy because they were seen as loyal to Saddam, and also migrant workers who were expelled by the Kuwaiti monarchy. Thousands of people were massacred by the U.S. military on the Highway of Death while they were fleeing. The U.S. had already won the war. It was a sadistic act to threaten, not Iraq, to threaten any other country, saying, if you go against us, we will massacre you. And that's why it's called the Highway of Death. You can see the horrific, the bird's eye view photos that just look like charred earth with hundreds of just cars and detritus. And that was the Powell Doctrine. So it's easy to talk about the second Iraq war and the lies at the UN, and it's important to talk about that. But he tried to do a 180 later on. He endorsed Obama. He tried to apologize, but he never apologized for devastating Iraqi civilian infrastructure. And after the Gulf War, the United Nations, which is obviously very often very biased toward the U.S., but even the United Nations published this report saying that the devastation in Iraq after the Gulf War was so bad that the country was, quote, near apocalyptic. And they said that it was on borderline famine conditions. And they said that the country was back in the, quote, dark ages. So this is what the Powell Doctrine was. This is what this war criminal was responsible for. And yeah, some Democrats tried to embrace him because he later criticized George H.W. Bush and endorsed Obama. But even they now all support George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush. He never criticized George H.W. Bush. He criticized George W. Bush. But even that, they now all support George W. Bush. So, like, I mean, the hypocrisy is just it's mind-blowing. It really shows a sick culture that people like this are praised. It really is a deeply sick culture, and that people don't know the most basic history about about the first Iraq war. That's 1991. Like, that's not that long ago.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think the entire spectacle around his death by the media across the spectrum really was a demonstration of how a few years after every crime, no matter how much it's criticized in the aftermath or like somewhat aftermath for maybe partisan reasons, it becomes normalized and okay. And that just goes along with the fact that, you know, after the Trump era, like all of these neocons and people who oversaw the invasion of Iraq in 2003 are all normalized on MSNBC now as like good moderates. And Colin Powell is like the moderate of moderates. He was always called a moderate. Like, one of the reasons that he played such an important role in convincing the country to go to war is because he was so widely respected by both parties. So his role was even in many ways more insidious than some of the other sort of like more blatant warmongers like Donald Rumsfeld's and Dick Cheney's. Anyway, I mean, it's just, and it also, of course, like he's also an example of somebody who rose to higher and higher levels of power because he followed orders well. like from Vietnam, right? Like he played a role in covering up the My Lai massacre, to Panama, to that first Gulf War, to on and on and on and on. And that's how you get kicked upstairs, is by being a good war criminal, basically.
Yes, man. Which,
yes.
I mean, it used to be called being an Eichmann. Like, and Eichmann, and
yeah.
Eichmann was tried and convicted for being complicit in those crimes. But now the modern day Eichmann, whatever you want to call them, they are praised as great moderates.
It's virtuous.
It's amazing. Like when you live outside of the US, and you see what it does around you, like you can't see the US flag in any other way. Like it's like looking at a Nazi flag. I don't mean that. I don't say that lightly. Like I know what that means to people, but like that the US is like industrial slaughter around the world in 100 different ways. And it's just like this parasite that sucks away life and resources and makes people bleed and die. And so like, it's just really hard to stomach when some war criminal dies and everybody just like behaves this way, because it's like watching Nazis. Like, I don't know how else to view it, but like Nazis who like gay people. I don't know.
But
I gotta say, there's a famous, in fact, like one of the most famous Sandinista, bringing us back to Nicaragua, one of the most famous Sandinista songs, going back to the beginning of the Sandinista movement, the main line is that los Yankees, los enemigos de la humanidad. The Yankees are the enemies of humanity.
I mean, how else to see it? Like, how else can you view it? Like, that's literally like all of the policies are like anti-human, right? Like, and people wonder why America's like so deeply hated and why there's so much resistance to it. I think the bravest people in the world are the ones who are willing to put their life on the line to like resist submitting to like the global emperor, to the global dictator. I respect it. I don't think I would never put my life on the line for that, because I'm a coward and I don't want to die. So like, I respect it on an even greater level. Like when I see Venezuelans and Cubans and even Iranians and groups like Hezbollah, like they refuse to submit and they're willing to fight for it. Like, it's kind of like incredible. And that's why I think that this sort of like new era that we're starting to very slowly enter, of there being like more space for global cooperation between these different forces, is a really important one.
Yeah, I would say just really briefly that I don't think we should be hesitant at all. It's saying that not only is it incredible, it is heroic and brave. And like those people like they're like on the front lines of what is really like a fight for humanity.
I mean, listen, when I think about,
I don't care if people take that out of context and say that like,
go for it.
Ben is praising. Go for it. Like, it's true. I don't care.
You can't listen. You cannot. I don't even. The biggest enemies of Hezbollah cannot deny that they're brave. I mean, this is a fucking group that was literally a bunch of peasant villagers picking up guns and fighting an occupier that was backed by the biggest military in the world. And they're still doing it. Like, they're still doing it. That is what they do. And all these like middle-class people in Lebanon who are like turning on that now, who never really mattered anyways, no offense. Like, none of those people matter because they're not the ones doing the fighting. They're just the ones talking. They're talking. That's all they do, is talk and have meetings and talk more. And like, they exist in their little safe bubbles, but they don't have to deal. They're not the peasant farmers whose houses are going to get bombed or occupied. They don't have to deal with that shit. So like, it doesn't matter. And I think I just raised that to say, like, you can't deny, like, people in Cuba are so unbelievably like brave and resilient and smart, and they've been able to withstand 60 years of being cut off from the world. Like Iran, look, it's not my favorite ideology in the world, but like, and it's not like, some leftist ideology that, I think is necessarily liberating completely, but I think it's really important to protect your sovereignty as a country and to push out imperialists. And that's what they do. And you can't call them anything but brave for that. They're standing up to the world's bully. And so, yeah, I'll say that out loud. I don't give a shit. Like, people can call that what they want, but
Me
Those
too,
people
yeah.
are brave. Yeah. Kevin's like,
Well, no, the last thing I just want to get in here is one thing I think we might be missing, just to play devil here, literal devil, is that there's a lot of like young Black people right now who are poisoned in Flint, Michigan. You know, they're under the terror of police. And I think they got to see this last week that if they try really hard, they might be able to rise up through the ranks of the military and be a war criminal someday, because that's the standard that Colin Powell set when he was was he like a 5-star military general, or did he get the highest status? I have no idea. I don't really give a shit. But no, I mean, it is really sad because there was that like blackwashing to all of his record, if you can call it
Killer
that.
Mike praised him.
It's like, and I'm left believing that like that to me is one of the most distressing aspects of our empire right now, is that we have so far to go as far as equality or maybe even diversity in some of the positions. I mean, there's still a lot of like these LGBTQ milestones left for some of these positions, Latinos, Black
I can't
people,
wait for
Black women. It's like,
I can't wait for the first trans war criminal. It's gonna be awesome.
Yeah.
You're really great.
Which, believe it or not, which is, by the way, a real like Patton Oswalt joke that people didn't freak out over, but talked about how like we would have like drones shooting and like bombing us here in the States.
I want a woman president. I want a gay president. I'm just letting you know, when we get those, there will be something horrible attached to them. By the time we get to gay president, that means we've got Soylent Green. That means we are putting people in a giant mulcher and just making energy bars out of them.
Oh, this would be something we can like end on. It's not on a lighter note, but it's like dark humor. I think it was like Human Rights Watch. I want to say Human Rights Watch, but it was some organization like that that released a report about how the elections in Iraq were not good because they didn't offer access to people with disabilities. There was elections in Iraq recently, a country the U.S. has destroyed. If it's disability unfriendly, it's sorry that we don't have ramps, okay? But the U.S. bombed everything kind of country. But on top of that, the elections were completely like fraudulent. And it actually ended up going in the U.S.'s favor in many ways. And so it was just funny to see that was the biggest complaint. Like there was actual like open fraud. And they were like, there wasn't access for people with disabilities. Like, man.
Well, unfortunately, I do have to go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ben. Really quickly, where can people follow your work? I'm sure they already know, but just in case.
Yeah. The Grayzone, that's graywithan.com, thegrayzone.com. And yeah, my podcast with Max is Moderate Rebels. Thanks to you too. It's always a pleasure being here. I love your show and keep up the awesome work.
It was good talking to you.
Great.
Thanks.
Once again, here's a reminder to support the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast by going to our Patreon or Rockfin or finding us on Spotify. On Patreon, we're at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. On Rockfin, you can subscribe to our channel at rockfin.com/unauthorized dis. And on Spotify, all you have to do is find our show, Unauthorized Disclosure, and become a paid subscriber. Thank you for supporting the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. We'll be back soon.